Some of humanity's oldest myths have dealt with the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, and the gods and heroes who look down at us from the sky. It seems like we have an innate fascination with what we can see beyond the Earth's surface. With advances in astronomy, we now know that there are in fact other worlds out there in the universe, creating fodder for more modern-day myths. Given what we know about the universe, how do modern filmmakers portray space? Just what does it mean to set a story outside of Earth? And why do so many artists do so? One of the first portrayals of a space voyage in cinema is the 1903 film A Trip to the Moon by French filmmaker Georges Méliès. Méliès had been a stage magician and was known for his elaborate special effects, on full display here. Inspired by stories by Jules Verne, the film portrays a group of scientists who travel to the moon in a capsule shot out of a cannon. The moon is shown to have a breathable atmosphere and is covered in plants and fungi. Here is where things get interesting. Not only is there inanimate life on the moon, there's inhabitants. Keep in mind, France at the turn of the century was a major world power. It was a huge center of industrial production, and the excitement around new technologies like the internal combustion engine and the camera led to a huge boom in science fiction stories like the ones that inspired the film. But France was also the center of a large and at times brutal colonial empire, and the decade leading up to the film's release saw some of the biggest and most violent expansions of French control in Africa. These colonial forces were often accompanied by scientists, interested in documenting and classifying the plants, animals, and people of the empire. With this in mind, the film's story of scientists who travel to a strange land, defeat its inhabitants, overthrow their king, and return triumphantly with a captive feels like a celebration of science as a tool of and excuse for colonialism. Except that the movie isn't really about science at all. The Voyagers at times look more like wizards than scientists, and the film blatantly ignores contemporary scientific knowledge about space. And that's completely intentional. Not just because it's a slapstick adventure movie, but to make a point. Many have interpreted the film as an anti-imperialist satire, and Méliès' previous work as an anti-nationalist political cartoonist supports this. But what if we miss the critical subtext here? Are depictions of hostile aliens simply a way to externalize xenophobia about our neighbors on Earth? The idea of cultural exchange between humans and aliens is an important recurring theme in space movies, showing up in everything from The Day the Earth Stood Still to Star Trek to Avatar, and intentionally or not often reflects how we get along on Earth. Movies about space travel continued to be a minor genre throughout the silent era, with a few movies like 1929's Woman in the Moon finding success. With the advent of sound and color, major studios became less interested in making movies about the silent void of space. And besides a few cheaply made serials like Flash Gordon, sci-fi largely fell by the wayside in favor of other genres until the end of World War II. Much like France at the turn of the century, post-war America was an industrial powerhouse and a center of innovation. The use of long-range missiles during World War II had formed the technological basis for NASA to look outside Earth's atmosphere, and many people saw space as the next frontier of scientific discovery. A series of Supreme Court cases in the 40s loosened the control of major studios and allowed for independent filmmakers to cheaply work in less prestigious genres. As a result, science fiction became hugely popular in the 40s and 50s, and aliens and astronauts were suddenly all the rage. And the depiction of space travel at this time was often surprisingly accurate. Astronauts in the 50s, both human and alien, tended to wear breathing helmets and travel in rockets. Sure, they might occasionally fight a robot in a gorilla suit or run into Santa Claus, but the basics were there. And as scientists got closer and closer to the goal of sending humans to explore space, the film industry kept pace. By the mid-1960s, Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn had been sent into orbit, and new techniques had made it possible to set entire movies in space and make it look realistic. By the end of the decade, all this had culminated in two crowning achievements: Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, and the landing of 3 men on the moon in 1969. Kubrick's film is an infamously sprawling and oblique epic. It reflects not just the cutting-edge science of the space race, but also the countercultural movement of that time, reflected in its psychedelic visuals and heavy references to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. But more than the open-endedness, more than the trippy final sequence, and more than the investigation of humanity, in contrast with both ape men and robots, what made 2001 a classic was its beautiful and realistic depiction of space travel. It's impossible to talk about the movie without discussing the iconic shots of spacecraft gracefully floating through space set to classical dance music. The groundbreaking special effects made it seem like characters were actually in zero gravity, and a sequence in which characters attend an archaeological dig on the moon bore so much resemblance to the actual footage from Apollo 11 that popular conspiracy theories credit Kubrick with having been hired to fake it. Kubrick also drew on then little understood concepts like black holes, relativity, and faster-than-light travel to inform the movie's infamously trippy and open-ended finale. 3 years later, the other major spacefaring power responded with Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky's film, Solaris. Unlike 2001, Solaris has almost no visual depictions of space. Tarkovsky believed that Western science fiction lacked emotional depth, and instead focused strongly on the interiority of his characters. Chris Kelvin, the protagonist of Solaris, is a psychologist, sent to check up on the crew of a space station orbiting the planet Solaris. Kelvin finds that the planet is covered in an intelligent life form, which is able to access the memories of the cosmonauts and create physical apparitions of people and places from their past. While 2001 portrays space travel as a way to learn to understand the universe and connect with the larger forces that influence our lives, Solaris uses the space voyage as a metaphor for an internal spiritual journey, and suggests that learning about the universe reveals more about ourselves. Of course, space movies since the mid-70s have largely been in the shadow of one particular series of movies. It goes without saying that Star Wars isn't particularly concerned with scientific accuracy. We can hear sound in space, we get a surprisingly close together asteroid belt, and that's not even mentioning what are basically wizards. Star Wars uses space specifically for the potential to throw out all the rules of setting a story on Earth. Rather than the hard sci-fi of other movies, Star Wars gives us an elaborate Lord of the Rings style fantasy world that just happens to be set on distant planets. Still, Lucas makes some interesting visual choices, modeling the special effects after Douglas Trumbull's work on 2001, and taking cues from footage of World War II dogfights to show the epic space battles. With some exceptions, space fantasy became the norm in post-Star Wars sci-fi. The 80s saw a remake of the old Flash Gordon movies, and a more flashy, plot-oriented sequel to 2001. On the other extreme, legendary experimental filmmaker Stan Brakhage challenged the typical visual depictions of space with his 1992 short film Stellar, made with his signature style of painting directly onto film. Rather than the dark void of space we're used to, Brakhage draws on the colorful images of galaxies produced by space telescopes, capable of observing multiple spectra of light. The 21st century saw a resurgence of space movies, including a 2002 remake of Solaris and the similarly themed Moon. Often focused on colonization more than exploration, many of these newer films reflect the environmentalist concerns that Earth might become uninhabitable in the near future. In The Martian, an astronaut struggles to survive when he's accidentally stranded on Mars. While the movie isn't the most optimistic portrayal of life on Mars, he ultimately survives using techniques that have actually been suggested as part of space colonization efforts, and it's implied his success in surviving alone on Mars will pave the way for future colonization. NASA actually worked closely with the filmmakers and helped promote the movie in order to generate interest in the space program, often with a nod at the idea that an actual Mars mission might not be too far off. James Cameron's Avatar serves as an anti-colonial allegory, perhaps pointing a critical eye at America's intentions of exploring space, in light of its contemporary foreign entanglements and environmental issues. The most explicitly environmentalist of these movies is Christopher Nolan's 2014 film Interstellar. Set in a future where the Earth has become nearly uninhabitable, the movie focuses on a mission sent through a wormhole to explore potentially habitable planets in a distant galaxy. Highly theoretical ideas about the bending of time play an important role in the film, as the main character is able to travel through the fourth dimension by entering a black hole. On a more grounded note, relativity plays an important part in the emotional arc of the film, as the main character's isolation from his family is accentuated by the fact that time appears much slower to him. Whether they take influence from or outright ignore current theories about the cosmos, space has always been an irresistible setting for filmmakers. After all, the same advances in optics and photography that allow us to capture images of space helped bring about the creation of the first motion pictures. It's almost as if cinema was invented to show us stories from outside our world. These stories can remind us of our past, or remind us to look forward to the future. They can be an escape or an urgent message. They can tell us to look within ourselves, or remind us how small we are in the universe. Because as we learn more about the universe and improve and question the methods we use to explore, we realize that space is what we make of it.